1981, Herman Ostry and his wife Donna moved to just outside of a small town called Plano, Nebraska. They moved to a farm, and on that farm, there was a barn. And in that barn, there was a problem. It was flooding. It was near a stream, and so the floor was always soggy and wet. And at one point, there had been a flood, and there was actually 29 inches of standing water in this barn. So Herman Ostry had a problem. Now, he knew of some companies that were nearby that, for a lot of money, could move his barn. But there was no way that they could afford to do that. One night at dinner with the family, he made a joke. He said, you know, if we just had enough people, we could just pick up this thing and move it. Everybody laughed and went on eating. A few days later, his son Mike, who was 25 at the time, came to him with a page full of calculations and equations and measurements. He had gone to the barn and he had counted every single board and timber in the barn. And he knew how much each one of those boards weighed. And he added it all together, 16,000 pounds. And they figured, you know, if we're going to pick this thing up, we probably ought to stabilize it with a steel grid and give it some handles. So that's going to weigh another 3,000 pounds. So 19,000 pounds, but if you divide that by about, 344 people, that's only 55 pounds a person. We ought to be able to do this. Well, it just so happened that the town of Plano, Nebraska was about to have a centennial that year. So they went to the centennial committee, and they proposed the idea of making this part of the centennial celebration. Now, one thing you need to know is that there was another town having a centennial nearby, and they had just created the world's largest cherry kolache. So not to be outdone, the Centennial Committee said, let's do it. So on July 30th, 1988, 4,000 people showed up at the Ostry farm to watch what was going to happen. 344 people came to help lift the barn. Now, those 4,000 people that came, they were either about to witness one of the most catastrophic events in the history of Nebraska, or they were about to see something beautiful. And so everybody went inside the barn and around the barn, and Herman Ostry, with his loudspeaker out front, gave them very deliberate, specific instructions. And in unison, listening to his voice, he said, let's lift it up. And it came off the ground. And the crowd went wild. They moved it 115 feet south, up a 6-foot elevation, turned it 90 degrees, and set it back down on blocks. Comes as no surprise to any of us that in foster care, the barn is flooded. And the problem with flooding is that our first reaction when we see flooding is to grab a bucket and start scooping. We're like, can somebody give me another bucket? We just need more buckets. If we just had more buckets, we'd be able to make this barn less wet. We ask for sandbags. We just need more sandbags. We just need more, better, faster. But what Herman Ostry knew is none of that was going to help him with his barn. He needed to move the barn. It needed to be moved. What we don't need in foster care is more foster care activity. What we need is foster care movement. It's time to move the barn. And so what we're going to talk about today are 4 principles of building foster care movement where you live, in your zip code, in your city, and in your state. And all of those principles come from the good folks of Plano, Nebraska. Principle number 1, if you're going to move a barn, know where you're going. Herman knew exactly where he needed to go to get to higher ground. It would have been silly for him to say, let's just move the barn a little bit so that the barn just gets a little bit less wet. So instead of 29 inches, we'll just have 21 inches of water standing in it. But that's what we do in foster care, right? We just hope to get a little bit more. We just hope that we just have less kids waiting in care. We just hope that we have a few more foster families. Get us another bucket. But we need to aim for higher ground. We need to know where we're going. And where we're going, I think, is not to get more. We don't need more. Where we're aiming is more than enough. We need the ground. We need to get this thing to dry ground. We need more than enough foster families for every kid to have an ideal placement. We need more than enough adoptive homes so every waiting kid has a family in this country. We need more than enough help for biological families trying to stay together and trying to reunify. And we need more than enough support for all of those families, for foster families, adoptive families, and biological families. That's what we're aiming at. That's dry ground. If you're going to move a barn, get some extra folks. According to the 1990 census, Bruno, Nebraska had 144 people. They needed 344 to move the barn. They had to go outside of town to get some extra folks. Wherever you sit today, you need to go outside of what you're normally used to, and you need to engage some other folks. Don't go to the county with your church alone. Go with 10 churches. Go with 25 or 50 churches. Get some other folks. You're going to need to build relationships with folks in government, folks in private agencies, folks in service organizations like CASA and mentoring organizations. It's going to take a lot of folks to move the barn to higher ground. Get some extra folks. Number 3, if you're going to move a barn, put the steel grid in place first. If not for the steel grid, Herman Ostry would have had 344 lawsuits on his hands. The steel grid is important. And what we're trying for here is we're not trying for more foster care activity. We're trying for foster care movement. And that's a spiritual movement. And no spiritual movement in the history of the church has ever been accomplished apart from prayer. Do not try to build movement in your zip code, in your city, in your state, apart from prayer. And I'm not talking about the kind of prayer that you open up your meetings with. I'm talking about the kind of prayer that is consistent and deliberate and systematic, and you're praying for kids, and you're praying for workers, and you're praying for foster parents, you're praying for pastors, you're praying for everybody involved in the system. Don't even try to start foster care movement without putting the steel grid in place. And number 4, if you're going to move a barn, listen to the guy with the bullhorn. Herman Ostry was out front. He was giving instruction. He was guiding them every step of the way, and they were listening to him, and they were doing everything he said, and they were doing it in unison. We have a guy with a bullhorn too, and he's given us his word, and he's given us instructions. And now I'm not even talking about the kinds of instructions that we often think of in this space. I'm not talking about James 1:27. We already know that one. We're already trying to apply that one. I'm talking about the kinds of instructions in the Bible that will actually help us, probably more than those verses even, build foster care movement. Verses like consider one another better than yourselves. Verses like be one. Verses that talk about how to handle conflict biblically. If you want to build foster care movement where you live, listen to the guy with a bullhorn. I was so intrigued by this story that I decided to call Herman Ostry up. He's in his 70s. I got to talk to him. I got to talk to his wife. We had a great conversation. And it was really fun. And it was fun to hear the delight in their voice. This was over 25 years ago, still to talk about this day and what it meant for them as a family to watch this happen. But I asked him, I said, Herman, tell me this. What advice would you give to a group of people who want to do something that's seemingly impossible? Something that nobody's ever seen done before. I mean, that's what he did. He did something that he hadn't watched on TV and said, oh, I can do that. He just did something that had never been seen before. And so I said, what advice would you have for a group of people like that? And he said, it's simple. Same advice that I got when I told somebody about the barn idea. Go for it. And it sounds really simple. It sounds almost overly simple. But don't we spend a lot of time wringing our hands that we need more buckets, that we can't afford the contractor to come in and move the barn, and so we're just going to have to deal with the flooded barn, and so we stand still and we don't do anything and we just live with the flooded barn? Herman Ostry would say, go for it. It's time to pick up the barn and move it.